The Loeb dynasty was, for a century, the quiet aristocracy of American finance. They were the absolute embodiment of our crowd, the elite, powerful, and insular group of German Jewish banking families who dominated Wall Street. In the Gilded Age, their firm, Kuhn, Loeb Company, founded in 1867, was the other great power, the only bank in the world that could and did go head-to-head with the great J.P. Morgan. This dynasty was founded by Solomon Loeb, a German immigrant who began as a humble cloth merchant and built an empire. Under the leadership of his brilliant son-in-law, Jacob Schiff, the family's fortune, estimated in the billions in today's money, was built on financing the very infrastructure of America, its railroads, its telegraphs, and its industrial titans. They were statesman bankers who financed governments, funded wars, and used their immense wealth to influence American policy and global philanthropy. But the story of the Loeb dynasty is a profound tragedy of dilution and disintegration. The old money firm, defined by its conservative prudence and aristocratic prestige, failed to adapt to the 20th century. Its power faded, its leadership faltered, and its name was ultimately consumed in a merger of equals with Lehman Brothers in 1977. This fateful merger, as it became known, was the beginning of the end, a culture clash that ultimately led to the firm's total erasure, culminating decades later in the catastrophic 2008 collapse of Lehman, which wiped the last vestiges of the Loeb legacy off the face of the earth. The patriarch of the family was Solomon Loeb, born in 1828 in Worms, Germany. He was a product of the tight-knit, ambitious German Jewish community. In 1849, Europe was on fire. The revolutions of 1848 had failed, unleashing a wave of political repression and anti-Semitism. Solomon Loeb, then just 21, joined the massive wave of 48ers, educated, liberal, and ambitious Germans fleeing their homeland for the promise of America. He did not arrive in New York, the center of finance. He went west to the frontier of Lafayette, Indiana. He was not a banker. He was a dry goods merchant, a clothier. He and his brothers, like many German Jewish immigrants, were part of a vast interconnected mercantile network. They would buy manufactured goods in the East and sell them on credit to the farmers and settlers pushing west. It was in this world that he met his partner, Abraham Kuhn, another German Jewish immigrant from Bavaria. The two men formed a partnership, first in Indiana, and then in 1857, they moved their successful dry goods business to Cincinnati, a major commercial hub. This was the dark past of their financial empire. It was not built on high finance, but on the humble, practical profits of selling cloth, tools, and textiles during the American boom, a boom that continued even through the panic of 1857. But Solomon Loeb was more ambitious. He saw that the real money was not in selling goods, it was in financing them. The Civil War had supercharged the American economy, and the center of that economy was no longer in the West. It was in New York City. In 1867, Solomon Loeb and Abraham Kuhn made their final historic move. They sold their dry goods business, moved to New York, and with $500,000 in capital, founded Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Their business model was a direct extension of their origins. They were outsiders. The established Yankee Wall Street, dominated by old white Anglo-Saxon Protestant families, was largely closed to them, so they leveraged the one network they did control, the German Jewish immigrant community. This was the Our Crowd network, a web of trust, intermarriage, and shared culture that connected the new Jewish banking houses of New York, the Lehmans, who had started in Alabama cotton, the Goldmans and the Saxies, who who were also merchants, and the Seligmans. Kuhn, Loeb Company began as a private bank serving this wealthy insular community. They were not at first investment bankers. They were, as Francis Martin Drexel had been, glorified money changers and safekeepers. They provided letters of credit for their German-American clients, exchanged foreign currencies, and, most importantly, they sold gold. In an era of unstable greenback paper currency, gold was the only trusted asset, and the German Jewish bankers were its primary brokers. They also, like the Drexels, saw the opportunity of the post-Civil War boom. The government needed to finance its massive war debt, and the railroads were laying thousands of miles of track to the Pacific. Both needed staggering amounts of capital. This was the pivot. The old money Yankee banks, like J.P. Morgan's, had the connections in London, but Kuhn, Loeb, had the connections in Germany. Solomon Loeb used his family and community network in Frankfurt and Mannheim to sell U.S. government and railroad bonds to German investors who saw America as a high-growth, stable investment. The firm's reputation for prudence and honesty, a stark contrast to the robber baron speculators of the era like Jay Gould, grew, but Kuhn, Loeb and Company, under the conservative, cautious leadership of Solomon Loeb, was still a second-tier firm. It was profitable, but it was not a power. That transformation, the one that would make the Loeb dynasty a rival to Morgan himself, came not from a son, but from a son-in-law. Solomon Loeb had a daughter, Teresa. In 1875, she married a young, brilliant, and fiercely ambitious German-Jewish immigrant named Jacob Schiff. Schiff, born in Frankfurt in 1847, was not a refugee like Solomon Loeb. He was a product of the German-Jewish banking aristocracy, a family that had been financiers to the archbishops of Mainz since the 14th century. He was, in a sense, a Rothschild of a different branch. He had come to America not to escape poverty, but to conquer a new market. He joined Kuhn, Loeb and Company in 1875, bringing with him his family's deep, old-world capital connections and a ruthless, strategic mind that the firm had lacked. When Solomon Loeb retired in 1885, leadership of the firm passed, in the classic Our Crowd tradition, to his son-in-law. The ascent of Jacob Schiff was the true beginning of the Loeb-Schiff dynasty. Schiff was not a merchant. He was a financial general. He immediately and aggressively moved the firm from a safe bond seller into a high-stakes, risk-taking underwriter. He saw that the railroad boom was far from over, and he aimed to control it. His target was the biggest prize of all, the Union Pacific Railroad. The Union Pacific, the railroad that had connected the continent, was a financial disaster. It had been looted by its own management in the Crédit Mobilier scandal of the 1870s, a scandal which, unlike the Drexels, the Loebs were not involved in, and had collapsed into bankruptcy during the Panic of 1873. It was a broken, massive, and seemingly unsalvageable wreck. While other bankers, including J.P. Morgan, refused to touch it, Jacob Schiff saw his opportunity. He allied with the railroad baron E.H. Harriman. In the 1880s, Schiff, through Kuhn, Loeb, masterminded the $100 million reorganization of the Union Pacific. He did not just sell its bonds, he guaranteed them. He used his German connections, his firm's capital, and his own ironclad reputation to raise the money, restructure the debt, and install Harriman as its new leader. It was a staggering success. The Union Pacific, under Harriman's management and Schiff's financing, became one of the most powerful and profitable corporations in the world, and Kuhn, Loeb and Company, which had earned a massive 5 to 10% underwriting fee, was now, in a single stroke, the dominant railroad bank in America. This put Jacob Schiff and the Loeb dynasty on a direct collision course with the only other man who believed he had the divine right to control America's railroads, J.P. Morgan. The rivalry was not just business, it was cultural. It was our crowd, the German Jewish elite, versus the 1899s, the Yankee Protestant establishment. Morgan, who'd inherited his father's partnership with the old money Drexels, saw Schiff and the new money Kuhn, Loeb, as upstarts. This rivalry culminated in the legendary Northern Pacific Panic of 1901, both Schiff backing Harriman and Morgan backing James J. Hill wanted control of the Northern Pacific Railway, a line that was crucial for access to Chicago. In a spectacular high-stakes battle, both banking houses began secretly buying up the railroad's stock. They bought so much so fast that they cornered the market. They had in their hubris bought more shares than actually existed for public trading. When the short sellers, speculators who had bet the stock would go down, needed to buy shares to cover their bets, there were none to be had. The price of Northern Pacific stock exploded from $110 to $1,000 per share in a single day. The stock market collapsed and a full-blown financial panic was triggered, bankrupting dozens of smaller firms. Schiff and Morgan, staring into the abyss of a mutual system-wide destruction, were forced to call a truce. They combined their holdings, creating the Northern Securities Company. This, in turn, was one of the first trusts to be broken up by President Teddy Roosevelt in 1904. But the 1901 panic was a clear signal. The outsider German Jewish firm of Kuhn, Loeb & Co. was now the equal and the rival of the House of Morgan. This rivalry was also evident in the great U.S. Steel deal of 1901. When J.P. Morgan was assembling his $1.4 billion steel trust, he could not do it alone. He needed his rival's capital and distribution network. Reluctantly, he invited Kuhn, Loeb and Company into the underwriting syndicate. The Loeb-Schiff dynasty took its multi-million-dollar share of the profits, cementing its place at the very center of American finance. But Jacob Schiff's ambition was not just domestic, it was global, and it was personal. Schiff was not just a banker. He was the undisputed leader of the American Jewish community. He was a statesman who saw his wealth as a divine instrument for protecting the Jewish people around the world. And his greatest enemy was Tsarist Russia, a regime infamous for its brutal, state-sponsored pogroms, massacres against its Jewish population. Schiff had spent years lobbying Washington, trying to get the U.S. government to punish Russia for its human rights abuses, all to no avail. In 1904, his opportunity for revenge arrived. The Russo-Japanese War broke out. Japan, an emerging non-Western power, desperately needed money to fight the Russian giant. They sent emissaries to London and New York. The Christian banks of London and the Morgan House, not wanting to upset the European balance of power, refused. The Japanese came to Jacob Schiff. Schiff, in a move that stunned the world, saw his chance. This was not a business deal. It was a holy war. He would personally finance Japan's war against the anti-Semitic Tsar. He staked his firm's entire reputation and a vast amount of its capital on this underdog Asian nation between 1904 and 1905. Kuhn, Loeb, and Company underwrote $200 million, over $6 billion today, in Japanese war bonds. This was the first time an Asian nation had ever raised money on Wall Street. It was a massive, unprecedented gamble. When Japan won the war, a stunning victory, sinking the entire Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima, Jacob Schiff was hailed as a hero. The Emperor of Japan awarded him the Order of the Sacred Treasure, but more importantly, He had helped to financially cripple the Russian Empire, an act that was a primary factor in triggering the 1905 Russian Revolution. He had used the Loeb family's capital to exact his own personal financial revenge on the Tsar. This was the peak of the Loeb-Schiff dynasty. Jacob Schiff was a global power, a prince of finance who could fund nations and topple empires. His family, which now included new partners like Felix Warburg, who married Schiff's daughter in 1895, and Otto Kuhn, was at the center of the Peugeot Committee investigations in 1912, where they, alongside J.P. Morgan, were investigated as part of what became known as the Money Trust, accused by investigators of holding a cartel-like grip on American finance. They funded the U.S. effort in World War I, selling billions in Liberty bonds, and poured their money into philanthropy, funding the Jewish Theological Seminary, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and a Galveston plan to resettle Russian Jewish immigrants in Texas. But this golden age was about to end. Jacob Schiff, the Old World patriarch, died in 1920. His son Mortimer Schiff took over, but he was not his father. He was a capable but uninspired second-generation manager, and he died suddenly in 1931. The firm, now led by partners who were not direct family, was suddenly adrift. It had lost its visionary autocratic leaders, and it was now facing a new hostile world. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, a direct response to the money trust fears, tore the financial world in two. It forced banks to choose between being a safe commercial bank or a risky investment bank. Kuhn, Loeb, like its rival Morgan Stanley, chose to be an investment bank. But in the 1950s and 60s, it failed to adapt. The world of relationship-based old money banking was dying. The cowboy traders of the new money firms, like Goldman Sachs and, fatefully, Lehman Brothers, were taking over, pioneering aggressive, high-risk, high-profit trading in stocks, not just safe bonds. Kuhn, Loeb, with its conservative, boring, bond-focused culture, was being left behind. It was becoming a prestigious old money relic. It was, in short, becoming the Drexel of its day, a great hollowed-out name, ripe for a fall. By the 1970s, the firm was in a death spiral. The cereal wars had been between two brothers. The Drexel War had been between a firm and its hijacker. But the final war of the Loeb dynasty would be a merger of equals, a desperate dynastic marriage of two old crowd Jewish firms, Kuhn, Loeb Company, and Lehman Brothers, both of whom were slowly bleeding to death. This fateful merger, as it was called, was not a rescue. It was a mutual suicide pact. The retirement of Solomon Loeb in 1885 marked the end of the first chapter of the Loeb dynasty. He was the patriarch, the cautious German merchant who had built a respectable, profitable, but second-tier firm. He had successfully transplanted his family's roots from the old world to the new. But the man who would take this solid foundation and build an empire upon it was not his son. It was his son-in-law, the man who had married his daughter, Teresa. His name was Jacob Schiff, and he was perhaps the single most important and powerful financier in American history that the average person has never heard of. Jacob Schiff, born in Frankfurt in 1847, was not a humble immigrant like Solomon Loeb. He was a product of the German Jewish banking aristocracy, a family that had been financiers in Frankfurt for centuries, a network allied with the Rothschilds and the Warburgs. He was an intense, brilliant, and fiercely ambitious man with a high nasal voice and a full patriarchal beard. He had come to America not to escape, but to conquer. When he joined Kuhn, Loeb & Coaters in 1875, he brought with him two things the firm desperately needed: deep institutional connections to European capital and a ruthless visionary ambition. When he took control in 1885, he immediately and aggressively pivoted the firm's strategy. He was not interested in his father-in-law's safe business of selling government bonds to German widows. He saw that the old money Yankee firms, led by J.P. Morgan, had a stranglehold on the single most important industry in America, the railroads. Schiff decided he was going to break that monopoly. His target was the biggest, most broken, and most notorious prize on the board, the Union Pacific Railroad. The Union Pacific was an American legend and an American disgrace. It was the railroad that had connected the continent, but it had been built on a foundation of massive, almost unbelievable corruption. The Credit Mobilier scandal of the 1870s, a plot where the railroad's own executives had created a fake construction company to fraudulently bill the U.S. government and themselves for tens of millions of dollars, had made the company a toxic symbol of Gilded Age greed. By the 1880s, the Union Pacific was a sprawling, mismanaged, and bankrupt wreck. It was, in short, junk. While other banks, including J.P. Morgan, refused to touch the contaminated asset, Jacob Schiff saw his opportunity. This was the quintessential Kuhn, Loeb move: find value where the old money establishment was too arrogant or too cautious to look. He formed an alliance with a brilliant, equally ruthless railroad operator named E.H. Harriman. In the 1880s and 1890s, Schiff and Harriman began a systematic, decade-long campaign to rebuild the Union Pacific. Schiff, acting as the brain and the bank, undertook one of the largest financial reorganizations in history. He used his vast European connections to raise $100 million, billions today, in new capital. He restructured the company's massive, complex debt. He ruthlessly bought out or crushed smaller competitors, and he installed Harriman as the new autocratic leader of the railroad. The gamble was a staggering success. Under Harriman's operational genius and Schiff's financial discipline, the bankrupt Union Pacific was transformed into the most powerful, efficient, and profitable railroad corporation in the world. And Kuhn, Loeb Company, which had taken a massive 5 to 10% underwriting fee on every bond issued, was now, in a single stroke, the dominant railroad bank in America. This victory had two immediate and world-changing consequences. First, it made the Loeb Schiff dynasty fabulously wealthy. Second, it put Jacob Schiff on a direct collision course with the only other man in the world who believed he had the divine right to control America's industrial economy, John Pierpont Morgan. The rivalry between Jacob Schiff and J.P. Morgan was not just business, it was cultural. It was a battle for the soul of Wall Street. It was our crowd, the new money German Jewish elite, versus the Yankee establishment, the old money Anglo-Saxon Protestant aristocracy. Morgan, who had inherited his father's partnership with the old money Drexels, saw Schiff and the Kuhn, Loeb partners as upstarts, outsiders who did not belong in the Club Schiff. In turn, saw Morgan as an arrogant, overrated bully. Their rivalry was personal, bitter, and defined by a deep mutual aristocratic contempt. This rivalry culminated in 1901 in the legendary Northern Pacific Panic, one of the most spectacular financial battles ever waged. The fight was over control of the Northern Pacific Railway, NP, a line that was critical for access to the Chicago freight hub. Both firms wanted it. Schiff, backing his man Harriman of the Union Pacific, began to secretly buy up Northern Pacific stock. At the exact same time, J.P. Morgan, backing his man James J. Hill of the Great Northern Railway, also began to secretly buy up the stock. It was a silent, high-stakes game of chicken, played by two financial titans. They were both buying millions of dollars worth of NP stock in cash on the open market, trying to gain a controlling interest before the other side knew what was happening. The problem was they were too successful. In a matter of days, the two banking houses, in their blind, ego-driven battle, had cornered the market. They had in fact bought more shares of Northern Pacific stock than actually existed for public trading. The short sellers, speculators on Wall Street who had bet that NP stock would go down, were now trapped. To close their short positions, they were legally required to buy NP stock and return it to their lenders. But there was none left to buy. Schiff and Morgan owned it all. The result was panic. The price of Northern Pacific stock, which had been trading at $110 a share, exploded. It shot up to $170, then $300, then $700. On May 9, 1901, it briefly touched $1,000 per share. The shorts were being annihilated. To raise the cash to buy these $1,000 shares, they were forced to sell everything else they owned: their U.S. Steel, their other railroads, their government bonds. The entire rest of the stock market collapsed as a tsunami of panic selling hit the floor. Dozens of smaller brokerage firms were bankrupted, and the U.S. economy was pushed to the brink of a full-scale financial crisis. Schiff and Morgan, staring into the abyss of a mutual, system-wide destruction they had both created, were finally forced to call a truce. They agreed to stop fighting. They pooled their Northern Pacific holdings and formed a new, massive holding company to manage all the Northwestern railroads. This new giant monopoly was called the Northern Securities Company. This truce was in itself an act of such staggering arrogance that it triggered the second and more powerful phase of the conflict. When President Teddy Roosevelt heard that these two bankers had, in a private war, nearly destroyed the U.S. economy and had solved it by creating a new illegal super-monopoly, he was enraged. In 1902, Roosevelt ordered his Attorney General to sue the Northern Securities Company under the Sherman Antitrust Act. In 1904, the Supreme Court ruled in Roosevelt's favor, and the trust was broken up. The Northern Pacific Panic was a crucial defining moment. It proved without a doubt that the outsider German Jewish firm of Kuhn, Loeb Company was now the equal and the rival of the House of Morgan. This rivalry was also evident that same year in the deal that defined the Gilded Age, the creation of U.S. Steel. When J.P. Morgan was assembling his $1.4 billion steel trust in 1901, the world's first billion-dollar corporation, he could not do it alone. The deal was too big. He needed his rival's capital and, more importantly, Schiff's vast European distribution network to sell the massive stock offering. Reluctantly, Morgan, the Yankee aristocrat, was forced to invite Kuhn, Loeb, and Co. into the underwriting syndicate. The Loeb-Schiff dynasty, as partners in the most lucrative deal in history, took their multi-million-dollar share of the profits, cementing their place at the very center of American finance. The firm's power was now absolute. Jacob Schiff, the patriarch, was at the peak of his influence. But his ambition was not just domestic. It was global, and it was intensely personal. Schiff was not just a banker. He was the undisputed leader of the American Jewish community. He was a statesman banker who saw his wealth not just as a tool for profit, but as a divine instrument for protecting the Jewish people around the world. And his greatest, most hated enemy was Tsarist Russia. Schiff, like all Jews of his era, was horrified by the brutal state-sponsored pogroms, violent massacres that the Tsar's regime was unleashing against its Jewish population. He saw the Tsar as a butcher, a medieval tyrant in a modern world. He had spent years lobbying the U.S. government to punish Russia for its human rights abuses, all to no avail. In 1904, his opportunity for revenge arrived. The Russo-Japanese War broke out. It was a classic David versus Goliath story. The small underdog and non-Western nation of Japan was fighting the massive Christian Russian Empire. Japan, an emerging industrial power, desperately needed money to finance its army and navy. They sent emissaries to the banking capitals of the world in London and New York. The Christian banks, the Morgan-affiliated houses, refused. They would not back the yellow race against a white European power. The Japanese came last to Jacob Schiff. Schiff, in a move that stunned the financial world, saw his chance. This was not a business deal. It was a holy war. He would personally finance Japan's war against the anti-Semitic Tsar. He, a single private citizen, would bring the Russian Empire to its knees. He staked his firm's entire reputation and a vast amount of its capital on this underdog Asian nation. It was the most audacious gamble of his career. Between 1904 and 1905, Kuhn, Loeb Company single-handedly underwrote $200 million, over $6 billion today, in Japanese war bonds. This was the first time an Asian nation had ever raised money on Wall Street. Schiff used his Our Crowd network, bringing in the Lehmans and the Seligmans and his European connections to place the bonds. When Japan won the war in 1905, a stunning, decisive victory, capped by the total annihilation of the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima, Jacob Schiff was hailed as a global hero. The Emperor of Japan awarded him the Order of the Sacred Treasure, the nation's highest honor for a foreigner. But more importantly, he had financially crippled the Russian Empire. The cost of the war and the debt it now owed to Schiff's syndicate was a primary factor in the 1905 Russian Revolution, a crisis that forced the Tsar to grant a constitution. Jacob Schiff had used the Loeb family's capital to exact his own personal financial revenge. This was the absolute peak of the Loeb-Schiff dynasty. Jacob Schiff was a global power, a prince of finance who could fund nations and topple empires. His family, which now included brilliant new partners like his other son-in-law Felix Warburg and the flamboyant, art-loving Otto Kuhn, who would finance the Metropolitan Opera, was at the center of the Pujo Committee investigations in 1912. This congressional investigation, the Drexel scandal of its day, accused Schiff and J.P. Morgan of being part of a vast secret money trust that held a cartel-like grip on American finance. The Pujo Committee, in a move that was tinged with its own anti-Semitism, painted the Our Crowd bankers as a shadowy, foreign-connected cabal. Schiff, the proud patriarch, was forced to testify, but he was defiant. He defended his firm, his network, and his right to finance the world. The investigation, while it proved no conspiracy, did lead directly to the creation of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which Schiff, as a believer in sound money, actually supported. And later, the Clayton Antitrust Act Schiff's firm and the Loeb dynasty had survived. They had funded the U.S. effort in World War I, selling billions in Liberty bonds. They had poured their money into philanthropy, funding the Jewish Theological Seminary, the New York Public Library, and a Galveston plan to resettle Russian Jewish immigrants in Texas. But the dynasty's power was not just financial, it was cultural, and it was wielded with the same sense of vengeance. Jacob Schiff's brilliant partner, Otto Kuhn, was a titan of finance, but he was still a new money Jew. When he tried to buy a private box at New York's old aristocratic Academy of Music, the old money Protestant board snubbed him. Kuhn's response was the ultimate Our Crowd move. He did not beg to be let in. He built his own opera house. Kuhn, along with the Vanderbilts, became the primary financier of the new Metropolitan Opera, pouring his personal fortune into it. He made the Met the most spectacular, star-studded, and artistically brilliant opera company in the world, a palace for the new aristocracy. The old Academy of Music, unable to compete, withered and went bankrupt. This was not just philanthropy, it was cultural revenge, but this golden age was about to end. The firm was defined by, and dependent on, the singular autocratic genius of Jacob Schiff, and Schiff died in 1920. His son Mortimer Schiff took over, but Mortimer, as mentioned, was not his father. He was a capable but uninspired second-generation manager. And when Mortimer died suddenly, in 1931, the firm's central family leadership was broken forever. The firm was now run by a committee of partners, men who lacked the vision and the autocratic power to force the firm to adapt to the new hostile world. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 was the first great blow. It was a direct legal assault on the money trust model that Schiff and Morgan had perfected. It tore the financial world in two, forcing banks to choose between being a safe commercial bank or a risky investment bank. Kuhn, Loeb, like its rival Morgan Stanley, chose to be an investment bank. But this decision cut them off from the massive, stable capital base of commercial deposits that had always funded their operations. They were now a pure investment bank, relying on their wits and their relationships, just as a new, more aggressive, and more dangerous form of Wall Street was being born. The post-World War II era was the age of the trader, the cowboy. The new money Wall Street of the 1950s and 60s was not about old-world relationships. It was about high-volume, high-risk equity trading. The old gentleman's business of underwriting safe bonds for railroads was boring, and more importantly, unprofitable. The real money was being made by the vulgarians, in the eyes of the Kuhn, Loeb partners, who were aggressively trading stocks for their own accounts. The new bulge bracket giants were rising: Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, and, fatefully, their old Our Crowd rival, Lehman Brothers. Kuhn, Loeb and Company refused to adapt. They were trapped by their own history, their own prestige. They were bondmen in a new world of stockmen. Their corporate culture was defined by a snobbish, aristocratic conservatism. They looked down on the grubby, high-risk business of equity trading. As the financial historian Charles Geist noted, the firm was dying of prestige. This clash of cultures was the central problem. The old patrician partners at Kuhn, Loeb saw themselves as statesmen. The new generation of traders saw them as fossils. While Goldman and Lehman were building massive, high-profit trading floors, Kuhn, Loeb's partners, were, as one contemporary described them, sitting in their wood-paneled offices, admiring their own tombstones. By the 1970s, the firm was in a death spiral. Their profits were evaporating. Their blue-chip railroad clients were a dying industry. They were losing their best young talent, who fled the boring firm for the high-octane, high-bonus world of their rivals Kuhn, Loeb. The firm that had once terrified J.P. Morgan was now a sleepy, third-tier, old money relic. It was, in short, becoming the Drexel of its day, a great hollowed-out name, ripe for a fall. And they were not alone. Their old rival, Lehman Brothers, was in the exact same sinking boat. The death of Jacob Schiff in 1920 was not just the passing of a patriarch. It was the beginning of the end for the Loeb dynasty, the Golden Age, where Schiff, the statesman banker, could rival J.P. Morgan and restructure the American railroad system had died with him. The firm, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, was left in the hands of a new, less formidable generation, just as the entire financial world was about to change in ways they could not or would not understand. The story of the dynasty's fall is not a sudden, dramatic explosion like the Drexel collapse. It is a slow 50-year-long decline, a tragedy of arrogance, dilution, and a catastrophic failure to adapt. The leadership of the firm passed, in the classic Our Crowd tradition, to Schiff's son, Mortimer L. Schiff, and his longtime partners, Felix Warburg, Schiff's other son-in-law, and Otto Kuhn. On paper, the firm was at its peak, its name synonymous with the great German Jewish banking houses that had financed the Gilded Age. But the seeds of its destruction were already planted. The first problem was dynastic. Mortimer Schiff, unlike his ferocious father, was a second-generation man. He was a capable, respected banker, but he was not a visionary. He was a custodian, not a conqueror. He was a product of the old money world, more comfortable with his art collections and philanthropic duties than with the cutthroat battles of the trading floor. When Mortimer died suddenly in 1931, the firm's central family leadership was broken forever. The firm was now run by a committee of partners, men like John L. Loeb Sr., a relative from a different branch, and other non-family members. But it lacked the singular autocratic will of a Jacob Schiff. It had become an institution, and like many institutions, it had become conservative to the point of stagnation. This new arrogant stagnation was perfectly captured by the story of Joseph P. Kennedy, the new money Irish Catholic speculator. In the 1920s, Kennedy, desperate for old money legitimacy, approached Kuhn, Loeb to do business. The patrician partners, disgusted by his grubby stock pool operations and his Irish heritage, essentially showed him the door. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Kennedy, infuriated by the snub, never forgot, and in a moment of perfect historical irony, he would later become the first ever chairman of the SEC, the very man who would gleefully enforce the Glass-Steagall Act, the dagger to the heart of the money trust model that Kuhn, Loeb had perfected. They had not just refused a client, they had created their own executioner. The second, more devastating blow was the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. This law, a direct populist response to the Pujo Committee's money trust investigation and the 1929 crash, was a dagger to the heart of the Our Crowd business model. It created a legal, unbreachable wall between commercial banking and investment banking. Firms like Kuhn, Loeb, and J.P. Morgan, which had done both, were forced to choose. The House of Morgan famously and painfully split itself in two. J.P. Morgan and Company remained a safe commercial bank, while a new spin-off firm, Morgan Stanley, was created to handle the risky investment banking. Kuhn, Loeb and Company made a different and ultimately fatal choice. They chose to remain an investment bank. This decision, which seemed logical at the time, cut them off from the massive, stable capital base of commercial deposits that had always funded their operations. They were now a pure investment bank, reliant on their wits and their relationships, just as a new, more aggressive, and more dangerous form of Wall Street was being born. The post-World War II era was the age of the trader, the cowboy. The new money Wall Street of the 1950s and 60s was not about old-world relationships. It was about high-volume, high-risk equity trading. The old gentleman's business of underwriting safe bonds for railroads was boring and, more importantly, unprofitable. The real money was being made by the vulgarians, in the eyes of the Kuhn, Loeb partners, who were aggressively trading stocks for their own accounts. The new bulge bracket giants were rising: Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and fatefully, their old Our Crowd rival, Lehman Brothers. Kuhn, Loeb & Co. refused to adapt. They were trapped by their own history, their own prestige. They were bond men in a new world of stockmen. Their corporate culture was defined by a snobbish, aristocratic conservatism. They looked down on the grubby, high-risk business of equity trading. As the financial historian Charles Geist noted, the firm was dying of prestige. This clash of cultures was the central problem. The old patrician partners at Kuhn, Loeb saw themselves as statesmen. The new generation of traders saw them as fossils. While Goldman and Lehman were building massive, high-profit trading floors, Kuhn, Loeb's partners, were, as one contemporary described them, sitting in their wood-paneled offices, admiring their own tombstones. By the 1970s, the firm was in a death spiral. Their profits were evaporating. Their blue-chip railroad clients were a dying industry. They were losing their best young talent, who fled the boring firm for the high-octane, high-bonus world of their rivals Kuhn, Loeb. The firm that had once terrified J.P. Morgan was now a sleepy third-tier old money relic. It was, in short, becoming the Drexel of its day, a great hollowed-out name, ripe for a fall. And they were not alone. Their old rival, Lehman Brothers, was in the exact same sinking boat. The Lehman dynasty, built on Alabama cotton and railroad finance, was also a member of our crowd. But it, too, was suffering from a dynastic crisis that was a perfect mirror of Kuhn, Loeb's. Lehman's own legendary, autocratic patriarch, Robert Bobby Lehman, had ruled the firm with an iron fist for decades. He was their Jacob Schiff. And when he died in 1969, he left a massive, unfillable power vacuum. Lehman Brothers instantly descended into a vicious internal civil war. The firm was not split by culture like Kuhn, Loeb. It was split by function. On one side were the bankers. These were the old guard, white shoe partners, led by the smooth, politically connected Pete Peterson, who would later found the Blackstone Group. They, like the Kuhn, Loeb partners, believed in the relationship business of advising CEOs and underwriting bonds. On the other side were the traders. These were the new money cowboys who ran the firm's muscular trading desk, led by the notoriously tough cigar-chomping Lou Glucksman. The traders were the ones generating the actual profits, and they held the gentlemen bankers in open, seething contempt. So by 1977, the two greatest old crowd, Jewish dynasties on Wall Street, were both bleeding to death. Kuhn, Loeb was dying of stagnation. Lehman Brothers was dying of infighting. They were two dinosaurs, too slow and too proud to survive in the new, faster, more brutal world. Desperate and facing financial oblivion, they decided on a last-ditch solution, the classic arranged marriage of dying aristocracies, a merger of equals. In 1977, the two firms announced they would merge. The new entity would be called Lehman Brothers, Kuhn, Loeb Incorporated. The deal, valued at around $50 million, was not a strategic masterstroke. It was what many on Wall Street viewed at the time as a mutual suicide pact. It was, as the Wall Street Journal noted, an attempt to combine two weak firms to make one strong one. But as every Wall Street analyst knew, when you combine two weak firms, you almost always get one larger weak firm. The financial press and Wall Street was immediately skeptical. This was not a merger of strengths. It was a merger of weaknesses. It was an attempt to smash together two profoundly dysfunctional and warring corporate cultures. The internal conflict that had defined the separate firms now became a single massive culture war inside the merged firm. The clash was immediate and catastrophic. It was, as one partner described it, a civil war in slow motion. The Kuhn, Loeb partners, who still saw themselves as the aristocracy of the deal, were conservative, analytical, and bond-focused. They were gentlemen who believed in long-term relationships, prudence, and their old money reputation. They had joined the firm believing their prestige would elevate the grubby Lehman traders. The Lehman Brothers partners were the barbarians. They were aggressive, high-risk traders, cowboys who lived on the adrenaline of the stock market. They saw the Kuhn, Loeb partners as stuffy, lazy, and deadwood, and they had no intention of sharing power. The Lehman traders, who were generating most of the new firm's meager profits, held the gentlemen of Kuhn, Loeb, in open contempt. They mocked their old-world traditions, their cautious strategies, and their lack of a killer instinct. The result was a paralysis. The new merged firm, which was supposed to be a powerhouse, was at war with itself. The two factions fought over everything: office space, bonus pools, and most importantly, strategy. The firm had no unified vision. It was a two-headed monster pulling in opposite directions. The Loeb faction wanted to invest in safe long-term bonds, while the Lehman faction wanted to make high-risk, high-reward bets on stocks. This internal chaos led directly to the financial massacre of the dynasty. The firm, crippled by infighting, was losing money. Its performance in the early 1980s was abysmal. And the Lehman Traders faction, led by the ruthless Lou Glucksman, finally made their move. They staged a brutal boardroom coup, forcing out the banker faction, led by Pete Peterson, who had brokered the merger. Glucksman, a pure trader, was now in sole control, and he had no sentimentality for the Kuhn-Loeb name. To him, it was just dead weight, a relic of a bygone era, a symbol of the stuffy bankers he had just defeated by 1984. Glucksman's own aggressive, high-risk trading strategies had nearly bankrupted the merged firm. He, in turn, was now desperate. He needed a white knight, a buyer with deep capital to save them. He found one, American Express. American Express, led by the empire builder Sanford Weill, was on a quest to build a financial supermarket. They had already bought the brokerage house Shearson Now. They saw a chance to buy the prestige of the Lehman and Kuhn, Loeb names for pennies on the dollar. In 1984, American Express acquired Lehman Brothers, Kuhn, Loeb Inc. for $360 million. This was the official ignominious end of the Loeb dynasty. The 117-year-old name, which had once been the equal of Morgan, was now just a minor asset, swallowed whole by a credit card company. The disintegration of the name was immediate. American Express merged the firm into its Shearson division, renaming the new entity Shearson Lehman Brothers. The Kuhn-Loeb name, the name of Solomon Loeb and Jacob Schiff, was erased from the letterhead. It was gone. The fateful merger of 1977 had proven to be a catastrophic failure. The Loeb family, in a desperate bid to save its old money legacy, had instead ensured its total and permanent annihilation. The old money partners of Kuhn-Loeb were scattered to the winds. They were either let go in the merger, or they left in disgust, unable to survive in the new aggressive Shearson culture. The dynasty that had financed the Union Pacific and the war against the Tsar had been dissolved, not by a market crash, but by a bad merger and a clash of cultures. The story of the Loeb dynasty does not end with a spectacular Drexel-style criminal implosion. It ends with a slow, quiet, and far more tragic disintegration. The firm, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, which had once rivaled J.P. Morgan and financed empires, did not explode. It simply and quietly faded away. The scandals that defined them were not crimes, but cultural flaws. Their greatest strength, the insular closed circle of our crowd, was the precise reason they could not adapt this inbred aristocracy. Forged as a defense against discrimination, became a tomb. They were bondmen in a world of stockmen, a museum of finance that was, as one historian noted, dying of prestige. The 1984 sale to American Express was not a murder. It was a burial. The Kuhn Loeb name was erased from the letterhead. The family's response to this final catastrophic disintegration was a quiet, aristocratic retreat. The financial dynasty was dead. The philanthropic dynasty would take its place. The descendants of the Loeb, Schiff, and Warburg families were, of course, still fabulously wealthy. They no longer had a company to run, so they focused on managing their own legacy. John L. Loeb Sr., the patriarch of the junior branch, dedicated himself to philanthropy, donating millions to Harvard University to build the Loeb Drama Center. His son John L. Loeb Jr. followed this new family business. He did not become a banker. He became a statesman, serving as the U.S. ambassador to Denmark. This was the new family business, legacy management. But the ultimate bitter irony of the fateful merger would not become clear for another 24 years. The firm that had swallowed them, Lehman Brothers, was itself a flawed entity. When it was spun off from American Express, it was still a cowboy trading firm. And in 2008, Lehman Brothers, which had absorbed the ghost of Kuhn, Loeb, finally and completely collapsed in the largest, most catastrophic bankruptcy in human history. The Lehman Bankruptcy Examiner's report in 2010 detailed the exact same flaws that had killed Kuhn, Loeb, a culture of arrogance, and a failure of risk management. The fateful merger of 1977 was not just a merger, it was a virus. The old money sickness of arrogance and the new money sickness of reckless trading had fused, creating a superbug that, when it finally died, took the entire global economy with it. The Loeb dynasty, in the end, was not just a failure. Its final bitter irony was that the firm which absorbed it, Lehman Brothers, collapsed in 2008, becoming a global symbol of the very same cultural arrogance and risk management failures that had destroyed Kuhn Loeb decades earlier.